This week, we're going to look at how biology affects behavior. In particular, the nervous system and parts of the brain. Let's talk about a number of different components. The first component is evolution. Okay, how did we get to be the way we are to begin with? And you can notice I have some dominoes in front of me. Well, you're going to find out what they're for. They're going to come in about the middle of it, so be prepared. The first thing I want to talk about is evolution and natural selection. This is an idea of how do we get where we are to begin with. And think Darwin, think natural selection. It's this survival of the fittest thing. And it's the fact that people who are more adaptive to their environment and people who are more likely to pass on their genetic material are going to pass on genetic material and have other people with the same traits. So, if being tall helps you in terms of surviving and being able to pass on genes and have kids, then you're going to have kids and your kids are going to be tall. That's one of the reasons why, for instance, they say people have gotten taller from generation to generation, because when you're talking about nutrition, typically having a good amount of nutrition allows you to reach your maximum height. So basically, looking at evolution and natural selection is this idea of survival of the fittest. It's those that are the most fit, or the most likely to pass on their genes, are going to pass on their characteristics. And that goes for physical characteristics and psychological characteristics and behaviors. People that are more extroverted might be more likely to meet people and have kids than those who are not so extroverted. Okay? So that's another way that you can explain behavior through genetics and natural selection. So, speaking of genetics is, a lot of you have taken biology classes where you talk about genetics. The first thing I want to talk about are the components, which are chromosomes, genes, and DNA. Well, DNA comes together to make genes, which come together to make chromosomes. You have DNA, which is that double helix, and a bunch of DNA makes a gene, and a bunch of genes make a chromosome. And we have 23, most humans have 23 pairs of chromosomes. There are some chromosomal abnormalities, but most humans have 23 pairs of chromosomes. 46 total, 23 pairs. And so how does that work? You go through the process of mitosis and meiosis, and you have an egg and a sperm cell, and they each have 23 chromosomes, and they come together to make 23 pairs. Well, with those 23 pairs, you have what's called phenotypes and genotypes. Genotype is what your chromosomes actually say. So, for instance, I have blue eyes. My genotype would be a blue-eyed gene from my mom and a blue-eyed gene from my dad. I know that because blue eyes are recessive. Okay? So my genotype would be blue eye, blue eye. My phenotype would be blue eyes. That's what you see. Okay? Now, sometimes genotype and phenotype match. A lot of times in recessive characteristics, phenotype and genotype match. I have the genes for blue eyes, and I also have blue eyes. Sometimes they don't match. I have a brother who has brown eyes. Okay? Now, I can almost 100% tell you that his phenotype and genotype don't match because my mom has blue eyes. So, my brother probably got a gene for blue eyes from my mom and brown eyes from my dad. And the brown eyes are what's called dominant. So here we go again. Another of these genetic terms, dominant versus recessive. A dominant trait is if you just have one of the genes, you see that trait in the phenotype. If you just have, you get a gene from your mom and a gene from you get a allele from your mom and one from your dad. And with dominant characteristics, you just get one of them, and that's the phenotype. With recessive characteristics, you have to have both. Blue eyes is an example of recessive. If I get a mixed brown and blue, I'm going to have brown eyes. In order to get blue eyes, I have to have both. There's other things that are also recessive traits. There's things like when you talk about recessive versus dominant, you can talk about traits like eye color. You can talk about traits like curly or straight hair. You can talk about traits like dimples. Some traits are dominant, which means you only need one. Some traits are recessive, which means you need the same thing from both your mom and your dad in order to have the trait. Then there's heterozygous versus homozygous. Homo just means the same, hetero means different. So, if I have, again, blue eyes, I'm homozygous recessive. Blue eyes are recessive. Blue eyes are also necessarily homozygous because I have two of them. They're the same. Homo means the same, and it means that you got the same thing from both mom and dad. Hetero means different. That mom and dad both gave you different things. Like mom may have given you a gene for blonde hair and dad may have given you a gene for dark hair, or vice versa. That's heterozygous, where you got different traits from different parents. So homo means the same, hetero means different. And dominant means you only need one of them. Recessive means you need both. Okay, so that's dominant, recessive, homozygous, heterozygous. When you're looking at also genetics and particularly this whole nature-nurture thing, your question is, how much of things are related to genetics? That's the study of heritability. How much of it is due to heredity or genetics? There's a whole research thing that's based on heritability. Heritability, for instance, how much of IQ is related to genetics? How much of schizophrenia is related to genetics? So on and so forth. So heritability is just the study of how much of something is related to your genetic makeup. Okay? The ways to measure that are things like twin studies, where you're looking at identical versus fraternal twins, because identical twins share genetic material. There are family studies looking at traits and how they're related with people of different relationships. In other words, you'll have somebody with schizophrenia, and you look in their family to see how many people have schizophrenia. Okay? So, that's measuring heritability. But when you talk about real traits, there's this thing called, there's a range of reaction in genetic environment correlations. In other words, what do you get into when you're trying to determine heritability? One is a range of reaction. And a range of reaction is when you have a potential, like somebody is born with a potential for how tall they're going to be. And within that range, you could end up being any of a bunch of heights. Okay? I truly believe this about IQ. I think people are born with a tremendous range of possible IQs, and their environment determines where in that range they will fall. So, speaking of that, how do environment and heredity interact? One way that they interact is passive. For most people, the person that gives you your genetics is the same person that gives you your environment. So if you're getting them both from the same place, then there's going to be some correlation. Your parents have very good verbal ability, so they're going to pass on that trait for good verbal ability. But they also like books, so they're also going to provide you with an environment that has a lot of books. So that's passive, that you get it from the same place. Evocative means that people with certain genetic components are going to bring out different environments, going to bring out different behaviors in people. Somebody who's tall is going to bring out people talking to them about basketball. Somebody who is extremely verbal is going to bring out people talking about books and people using a lot of sophisticated vocabulary. So evocative means that because of your genetic makeup, you're going to evoke or bring out different reactions. And then there's active, which is like niche picking. What does that mean? It means that because of your genetic material, you may actively seek certain environments. Because you were born with good math ability, you may actively seek math classes. Or because you were born tall, you may actively seek basketball. Okay? That's active. So there's passive, evocative, and active. Well, the next thing to talk about is how do the little processes work? We talked about the big picture of genetics, and now we want to get microscopic, talking about neurons. Now, neurons are the individual components of the nervous system. Okay? And let me show you what a neuron looks like. We have the cell body, okay, sometimes called the soma, and we have coming off of the cell body these little branch-like structures. Okay, little branch-like structures, and those are called dendrites. So we have cell body, we have dendrites, okay, then we have this bundle of nerves, okay, and this is called the axon. Okay. Coating this axon is this coating almost like you have a coating on a wire, okay, almost like insulation on a wire. This is called the myelin sheath. And this is, at the end, terminal button. That's a nerve. Okay. Well, how does that work? What you have is what's called the action potential. So, you're going to have some chemicals that are going to be picked up by the dendrites, and what's going to happen is that the membrane in the dendrites, the cell membrane, is what's going to be called resting potential, which is slightly negatively charged. The membrane is going to become permeable, and it's going to let some positive ions get in there, and the positive ions are going to change the charge. Well, it's going to change the charge, and then it's going to want to rebound. So it's going to cause some ions to go out. What's going to happen is it's going to change the membrane where the ions can get in down the road, okay? And it's going to keep going, and that action potential is going to travel down the neuron. It's an exchange of ions, and it's going to travel down the neuron. So it starts at resting potential, then it's going to become polarized, or it's going to get a different charge. And then after that goes through, okay, after that chain of reactions goes through, it's going to have what's called a refractory period. It's going to have a time when it can't fire. This brings me to the dominoes. Okay, so what I said was you have some chemicals. The chemicals are called neurotransmitters, and we're going to get into that. Some chemicals that are picked up by the dendrites. Well, they're picked up by the dendrites, and if just enough chemical gets picked up, it's going to start the chain of events. Now, I could just touch this, and if I don't touch it enough, it's not going to go, right? I could touch it just enough, and these dominoes will fall. I could slam it, and they're still going to fall. This is what's called the all or nothing principle, or all or none principle. If I give it just enough oomph, it's going to go. That's the action potential. If I give it just enough neurotransmitter, it's going to go. Okay? Now, neurotransmitters. What are the main neurotransmitters? Well, there's acetylcholine, dopamine, GABA, norepinephrine, and serotonin. I'm going to talk about a couple of those. Dopamine is one that's noted in mood, and a neurotransmitter that is been suggested to have to do with both schizophrenia and Parkinson's disease. Okay, that's dopamine. GABA is pretty much a neurotransmitter that's inhibitory, which means if it's in that little synapse or in that little around the dendrite, then it's going to make it less likely that it's going to fire. That's inhibitory. Okay. Then we have norepinephrine and serotonin. Well, serotonin is another kind of big one. Serotonin is a neurotransmitter that's talked about when you talk about depression, because a number of antidepressants are what are called SSRIs, specific serotonin reuptake inhibitors. So what happens is you have this end of this neuron. Okay, the action potential travels down. This terminal button spits out neurotransmitter. Okay, in this case it would be serotonin. Well, eventually it gets sucked back in. Reuptake occurs. It gets sucked back in. Some antidepressants prevent that reuptake. So what it means is that there is more serotonin left in that synapse or that piece. That's how it works. So serotonin, think depression. Okay, so that's the neuron and neurotransmitters. We have a couple other things to go through. Let's get grand scale here. Let's talk about parts of the nervous system. We have central versus peripheral. Central nervous system is the brain and spinal cord. Peripheral is everything else. Simple. We have sympathetic versus parasympathetic. Sympathetic, think arousal. Think fight or flight. Think everything's revved up. Your heart's beating, you're breathing heavy. That's sympathetic. Parasympathetic is you're just chilling. Digestion. Okay, digestion and just everything is kind of mellow. That's parasympathetic. Okay. Another thing is when you're talking about central, let's talk about the brain and spinal cord. Did you know that you can move without your brain even knowing it? If I bonked my elbow and I just naturally jerked, or if this was hot and I touched it and I jerked back, sometimes my brain doesn't even have to be involved. Reflexes are when you get a sensory input and it goes to your spinal cord and just immediately goes back out without even involving your brain. Okay, so that's general parts of the nervous system. Let's get into the brain specifically. We have, the brain is divided into two parts. And down the middle, we have this band of tissue called the corpus callosum. Corpus callosum is, again, that band that connects right and left hemispheres of your brain. One thing that's interesting is that females actually tend to have a thicker corpus callosum than males. Can we say multitasking? Who knows? Can we say women's brains think more like web pages where they're thinking about 10 million things? Who knows? And that doesn't mean that it's a causal relationship either. So, corpus callosum is that band of tissue, and lateralization is the right brain, left brain thing. Now, you guys have probably heard of right brain, left brain. There's a little bit to it. There's a little bit of specialization in terms of hemispheres, but it's not hard and fast, and the brain can reroute itself if there's an injury. And different people, it's not the same for everybody. So, slightly true. There are some things that tend to be slightly different, but it's not 100%, and it's not with everybody. So then we get the idea of language functions. Before we get into the specific areas, let's talk about some specific things, and that's language. A lot of intro-psych textbooks mention Broca's and Wernicke's because they have to do with language. Broca's area, if you have a problem there, then you're going to have trouble getting the words out. It's the motor control of speech. Wernicke's area, it's more comprehension. The motor's fine and you can say words, but the words aren't going to make any sense. That's Broca's and Wernicke's. Okay, so let's go take a tour of the brain, starting with the base. We have the part of the brain right near the brainstem, and that's where we have the medulla, the pons, the cerebellum, and the reticular formation. Although reticular formation kind of spreads across different areas, so there's a question there. But anyway, the medulla, pons, cerebellum. The medulla, think medusa, think can kill you, think heart rate, breathing. Okay. And I'm going to pick just a few out of each. The cerebellum is voluntary movements. In other words, the cerebellum is the part of my brain that allows me to walk smoothly and pace. Okay, that's cerebellum. One of the theories is people with Parkinson's disease, it's a dopamine issue, but it's a dopamine issue in areas of the cerebellum. So, and there's other areas of the brain involved also, but the cerebellum, think voluntary movement. So that's the hindbrain. That's the basic part. Think things that are rudimentary, life and death, moving, breathing, heart rate. Then you have the forebrain, and with that, a lot of what's called the limbic system. You have the thalamus. The thalamus is a relay center. The messages come into the thalamus decides where to send them. You have the hypothalamus, which we're going to find out has a lot to do with things like hunger, okay, hunger and sex. You have the hippocampus. The hippocampus, what it's known for, if you guys have heard the saying, an elephant can't forget. Well, think a hippo can't forget. Hippocampus is really big in terms of memory, and specifically memory such as facts and figures and events, and putting those from short-term to long-term. In other words, you're experiencing something, and the hippocampus is kind of what makes it stick. And then the last one is the amygdala. When you think amygdala, think fight or flight. Think things like fear and anger. People with damage to the amygdala sometimes have trouble reading expressions and knowing if people are angry or afraid or what. Okay, so that's the amygdala. Then we're getting bigger. We have the cerebral cortex, which is the real outside of the brain, and there's the frontal, parietal, occipital, and temporal. Frontal, parietal, occipital, and temporal. Your frontal lobe is the executive processor kind of thing. Your frontal lobe is the part of your brain that plans and categorizes and analyzes. It's the part of the brain that kind of puts everything together. And it's kind of the CEO, the executive piece. It's the most advanced piece. The parietal, think a lot of sensory stuff. Somatosensory cortex is in the parietal lobe. Occipital, think vision. Temporal, think language and hearing. Okay, those are the 4 lobes of the brain. So, we have the major parts of the brain. How do we know that those parts compose those functions? How do we know that the amygdala, for instance, has to do with emotions? Well, there's a number of different things. There are people who take advantage, is a weird way to say it, but take advantage of accidents or injuries. They look at people who have had damage to certain areas of the brain and see how they've been affected. That's one way. There are also different ways to take pictures or scan the brains. There's EEGs, which is looking at brain waves. There's CT scans, PET scans, and MRIs. MRIs are more radio waves, okay, and CTs and CAT scans are more X-ray kind of things with the brain. And I'm sure some of you have had things like CAT scans. So those are ways to tell if different parts of the brain control different things and what happened. So that's brain research. The last piece, if you're looking at biopsychology and how your biology affects your behavior, is the endocrine system. The endocrine system, think hormones. Okay? The regular nervous system has neurotransmitters. The endocrine system spits out chemicals that are called hormones. You have the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland is kind of the CEO or master gland of the endocrine system. It's the one that controls everything and kind of tells everybody else what to do. It's the pituitary gland, for instance, is the gland that gets things moving when teenagers go through puberty. It's the part that says, okay guys, let's go. Then there is the pineal, thyroid, and adrenal. Again, I'm going to pick a couple of those. Your thyroid has to do with metabolism. I'm guessing at least somebody in this class has to take thyroid medicine. It's pretty common, and if you don't now, I'm sure some of you will when you get older. It's not an uncommon thing to be hypothyroid or low thyroid. Your thyroid controls your metabolism, and it basically tells your body how to process stuff. And if your thyroid is overactive, then that means your metabolism is going to be high. If your thyroid is underactive, your metabolism is going to be slow. So people that have an underactive thyroid may notice that they gain weight very easily, that they tend to be a little lethargic, and things like that. So your thyroid levels can make a difference. That's thyroid. Your adrenal gland, think adrenaline. Think that rush, okay? That's your adrenal gland. The last part of the endocrine system is your gonads or sex organs. Now, pretty simple. The ovaries tend to produce estrogen, and the testes tend to produce testosterone. And that's pretty much the function. They're part of the endocrine system, and they're what's responsible for how people develop in puberty, secondary sex characteristics, why men look like men and women look like women. One fact that I will leave you with is, did you know that men and women all have both estrogen and testosterone? It's just that women tend to have a lot more estrogen and men tend to have a lot more testosterone. It's the balance of the two